concludes all operations of the emergency alert system. All stations may now resume regular programming.
For expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy.
Alright, so we have a lot to talk about this time. However, to start, a few light stories indicating just how far gone the media is. Now, you probably saw this, but how dare they demonize the memes? Memes led to an insurrection, they say. Such a great insight. They really are shameless. If you like the media claiming that inflation is good for you, then you are really going to like nuclear war is good for the planet. Anyway, there are so many of these insanely funny stories. The gaslighting is just going to new levels every single day. But let's get into some serious stuff. So to start, we have some info related to the Nord Stream sabotage. So according to Secretary Blinken, the Nord Stream pipeline bombing offers tremendous strategic opportunity for years to come. Wow, who knew Russia was actually on our side? They blew up their own pipeline so the West could have strategic opportunities for years. I mean, wow. Now that right there is a really nice gesture. However, on the Russia topics, Putin ally recommends that Russia use low-yield nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Yeah, let's not do that. I will say that I'm not sure if a nuclear strike is actually going to happen. Back in the 1960s and early 70s, the Council on Foreign Relations, Henry Kissinger, and yes, even Klaus Schwab himself. You know, back when he worked with his father's Nazi-tied company Escher Weiss. Well, they helped spread nuclear technology to various nations, believing that the threat of mutually assured destruction would deter any future use of nuclear weapons. And it did seem to work, so far. The conversation seems to be that nuclear war is a very likely scenario if Russia feels as if they are backed into a corner. The premise being that a nuclear attack, which might actually mean mutual destruction among superpowers, is just as devastating as the consequences of Russia losing the war flat out. So basically, if losing the war and taking all the baggage along with it equals the destruction of Russia, and then nuclear war might also equal the destruction of Russia. However, if it offers them the slim possibility of regaining an upper hand, well then Russia might take that gamble. There is one thing that we should keep in mind. So the Nord Stream pipeline attack really hurts Russia. The profits off of that was funding their war effort in some manner, and was also a major aspect to their economy in general. As far as I understand it, there's Nord Stream pipelines 1 and 2, and then you have Gazprom. Gazprom actually runs through Ukraine. Again, if Nord Stream is down, which it is, and if NATO gains control of Gazprom, well then the West really has Russia in a bind. And you know, it's actually a pretty good idea, except for the ramifications of escalation. If this didn't bring us closer to World War III, then yes, I would say it seems to me that this is a good tactical move. However, that does back Russia into a corner, and as we said, this could cause a dramatic escalation. Now from there, we have to talk about how Russia mobilized their nuclear assets. So could this just be a warning that he's serious? But I don't know, things are reaching a boiling point. But now, we have to talk about something else that has been mentioned. They have been talking about a tsunami bomb. So when I was researching tsunami bombs for this segment, I came across something interesting. Check this out and then we'll get back to the real topics. Just a little tangent, bear with me. And I quote, "The military has a long and honorable history, but part of that history includes some weapons experiments that in hindsight seem downright wacky and some even evil. Everything from a quote-unquote gay bomb that tried to incapacitate soldiers through uncontrollable homosexual urges, all the way to extrasensory perception experiments that attempted to give soldiers psychic vision. Well, they have been subject of serious military investigations. And during World War II, the US military devised a way to create a quote-unquote tsunami bomb. The tsunami bomb, developed in cooperation with authorities in New Zealand, was designed to inundate an enemy city under a 33-foot tsunami wave. Codenamed Project SEAL, the top-secret military operation was created in 1944 after E.A. Gibson, a U.S. naval officer, noticed how using explosives to destroy coral reefs around the Pacific Islands would often generate large waves. From there, a series of tests were conducted around New Zealand during the war to evaluate the feasibility of tsunami bombs. And when done correctly, it worked. That was back in the 1940s, and it was developed by the U.S. So in this video, you can see a Russian general threaten the UK with a tsunami bomb.
Столь мал, что лишь одной ракеты «Сармат» достаточно, чтобы его утопить раз и навсегда. Российской ракете «Сармат», самой мощной в мире.
Новое смертельное гиперзвуковое оружие способно уничтожить территорию размером с Техас или Англию.
Это всего лишь один пуск, Борис, а Англии нет. Раз и навсегда. Зачем заигрываться? Другой вариант – погрузить Британию в морскую пучину российский подводный робот-беспилотник «Посейдон». Он приближается к цели на километровой глубине со скоростью 200 км в час. Нет никакого способа остановить этот подводный дрон. Боеголовка на нем мощностью до 100 мегатонн. Взрыв этой термоядерной торпеды у берегов Британии поднимет гигантскую волну, цунами высотой до 500 метров. Такой водяной шквал является еще и носителем экстремальных доз радиации. Пройдя над Британскими островами, он превратит то, что от них, может быть, еще и останется, в радиоактивную пустыню, надолго непригодную хоть для чего.
The so-called doomsday weapon, one of the most deadly weapons in the Russian nuclear arsenal, is the Poseidon torpedo. This is what they just mobilized. This is capable of causing a radioactive tsunami that destroys entire cities. Or so they say. Now I heard a good argument regarding why we could be in store for something much, much bigger. At this point, would it surprise any of you if nuclear weapons are outdated? I wouldn't be surprised. Nukes were developed in the 1940s, and there are stories about how various arsenals of nukes are still stuck in the 1970s. In disarray, I believe they said. Which I don't think is true. The US nuclear arsenal has teams of soldiers who regularly perform maintenance on the ICBMs, and they replace the fuel on a regular basis as well. However, my point remains. We all know about the black budget, secret access programs, DARPA research, the corporate side of the military-industrial complex, and if I was a betting man, I'd put money on the fact that there are weapons we have no idea about. It sounds so stupid to even say. Of course there are weapons we have no idea about. I don't know why there are so many people who question the veracity of this claim. We have no idea about the true capabilities or scientific and technological advancements that have occurred in the shadows. However, in general, war is about resource management. There is something commonly called the quote-unquote bad man narrative. It is used as a way to sell war to the public. If only this one bad man was gone, then everything would be peaceful and we could live happily ever after. In a rather condescending manner, it's explained as an easy way to trick stupid people into supporting conflict, when in reality, every war comes down to resource management. This takes the form in either straight-up economics, war for profits, or to solidify control of a region rife with natural resources, minerals, metals, etc. Or at the very least, it is to install a friendly government apparatus in that area to allow for the corporatization of said materials. Now, I'm moving away from my notes here, so give me some slack with dates. But this brings us back to the war in Syria, sometime between 2011 and 2014. All of that, including Russia and the USA backing opposite sides of rebel forces. Of course, we have to mention the sparking of the Syrian civil war. All of it. It was about who was going to control a pipeline. Most, and dare I say the rest of the narratives, were in some sort of attempt to just sell the reason for our involvement to the public. I mean, they can't just say, hey, we're going in because we need that shit for the liberal economic order. And that is why they seek to weaponize the morals that Americans collectively hold. It's sick. You know, there is something to the US population, that we legitimately want to help the rest of the world. We want to free citizens from oppression. We want to be liberators. Whether you like it or not, it's kind of baked into the American ideal. And I think most of us have a part of them who says, yeah, we should definitely go help. But that is what they use against us to get us involved in conflicts for their economic gain. It's really sick when you think about it. Now, for some examples, the story about Syrian babies in incubators comes to mind. And it was actually the same narrative that was used to get people into Kuwait back in 1992, I think. This is crazy stuff. And then, of course, the weapons of mass destruction narrative from Bush and Tony Blair. Lest we forget, the guy who worked to expose that lie was, well, he was Epstein, if you get my drift. Just, when you have time, look up the story of Dr. Kelly, Tony Blair's chemical weapons expert. I think they're hiding something. By the way, I will say that yes, Syria was committing atrocities, but it was not about that for global powers. Geopolitics very rarely, these days at least, have any moral reasoning behind their motive. There are so many aspects to this that fall within the gray area of reasoning too. And what I mean is, it's not black and white. It's not something that's easy to discern. We have to keep in mind that ISIS was operating out of Syria at that time. However, we'd also have to go into how ISIS sprung up in the first place. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda, I believe they go back to the Russian invasion in the 1970s. It seems to me that everything really comes back to that. But, I'm no expert in this. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of the world. So if I'm wrong, just let me know. And, one more caveat. All of this does not reflect on the work that US soldiers have done around the world either. These two premises are not mutually exclusive. US soldiers have, as a matter of fact, provided great respite to people living under despotic and oppressive regimes. At the same time, world leaders don't particularly give a shit about any of that. It's about resources or a part of a broader plan. The thing is, if Russia does use a low-yield nuke, I'm still not sure if the US would respond in kind. At that point, there is only one response, and it ends with the complete annihilation of humanity, more than likely life itself. But let me know what you think. What do you believe will happen? I don't know, it's a disaster in the making. Really, what do you do? It's an escalation that only leads to complete destruction. However, we do have to note that former CIA Director David Petraeus has predicted that, and I quote, "We would respond by leading a NATO effort, a collective effort, that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see, every single force that we can identify on the battlefield in Ukraine, and also in Crimea, and we would hit every ship in the Black Sea." End of quote. Now, I really wish I had some sort of idea of where this is going, but we should all assume that it's not going anywhere good. So from there, Putin annexed 4 Ukrainian territories in a Kremlin ceremony. This is when they claimed that if any attack on those new Russian territories is attacked, then they would use nukes. Now from there, we have to note that Ukraine is claiming wins within their effort to reclaim territory. Over the weekend, Ukrainian forces liberated the strategically important city of Lyman in the newly annexed Donetsk region, and have continued making new gains in the Kherson region as well, which Russia also now claims to own. So really though, with the media being what it is, it's really hard to tell what the truth is, as we are inundated with lies constantly. Really, who knows? However, I'm interested in what you think, not the media, so make sure to let me know what you believe is going to happen next. However, based upon the topics in the last video, the war is helping with their quote-unquote transition. Well, that was the premise anyway, and we are consistently getting little bits of information that point to the exacerbation of the conflict in order to pursue their global agenda. From the BlackRock CEO, the Ukraine war could speed up digital currency adoption. Yes, coincidentally, all of this really does help with their agenda. Anyway, let's talk about Iran for a moment. The protests have blossomed into anti-government rallies across the nation, drawing crowds onto the streets from across the country and calls for a nationwide strike on Monday and Wednesday. Women across Iran have been protesting the country's mandatory dress codes, with videos posted online showing women burning their hijabs and cutting their hair on public streets. Anyway, massive protests are occurring in Iran, countering religious fundamentalism and the persecution of women in the region. And I was watching this interview with a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel, and he reminded me of some interesting information that I, personally, tend to forget from time to time. So, in the 1960s and 70s, Iran was actually a pretty progressive nation, at least in the city centers. There were still tribal issues out in the country, but the cities themselves were pretty relaxed. You could see women in miniskirts, bikinis, and he even said that there were people, just smoking weed out in the open. But then Russia invaded Afghanistan in the 1970s. And when they did, their modus operandi included targeting tribal leaders, who were massively influential. And when Russia did that, a power vacuum appeared and it spread throughout the entire Middle East. Various warlords moved into the area, and religious fundamentalism, persecution, and just an overall degradation of their society began to occur. 50 years later, the Middle East is still in chaos, and they just haven't really recovered. I just thought that was interesting. Russia kicked off the Middle East chaos a long time ago. Now, according to reports, more than 75 people have been killed during the protests by the regime. So in the video playing right now, you can see Iran security forces shoot straight at a woman who was filming them when they were trying to take a protester away. This is some crazy stuff. Anyway, the point of why I'm bringing this up, really, is because Iran has accused Western leaders of trying to violate its sovereignty. And I quote, "They did all they could to support the riots." And I quote again, "Attempts to violate Iran's sovereignty will not go unanswered." And then from there, we got a clip of Iranian politicians, or whatever they call themselves. Well, it shows them chanting "Death to America." I mean, you know, how wholesome. You want to know the best thing we could do for people who chant "Death to America"? Well, I mean, obviously, we should continue with the Iran nuke deal. Come on, doesn't that make the most sense? Of course it doesn't. Anyway, let's move on. The director of the UN World Food Program, David Beasley, said, and I quote, "I'm asking world leaders, I don't care how you feel about Russia, China, or anything. Fertilizer has to move to bring food security to the rest of the world. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos all over the world." And yes, there will be chaos all over the world, that is true. However, don't you believe that it's naive to think that world leaders do not understand this? Every single one of them has to be aware of the crisis that they essentially caused. And if you want to be frank about it, they did cause it, okay? They did.
We're facing a food pricing problem in 2022 that's creating havoc around the world. Well, if we don't get on top of this thing quickly, and I don't mean next year, I mean this year, you will have a food availability problem in 2023, and that's going to be hell on earth. We're looking at an $11 billion shortfall of food production inside Africa alone. Now I could go to Central America, South America, same issues on droughts. India, devastated by heat and drought, and it could go on and on. The world produces enough food to feed everybody on the planet, over 7.7 billion people. 50% of that food is because of fertilizer. So if you don't have fertilizer, you can't have harvest at the yields that you need. The fertilizers that we're talking about, number one, China's got a complete export ban on fertilizer. Number two, the number two producer of fertilizer in the world is Russia. And they are struggling to get the fertilizer out. I'm asking world leaders, I don't care how you feel about Russia, China, or anything, fertilizers have got to move to bring food security to the rest of the world. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos all over the world. The other factor is inflation and the value of the dollar. Because the value of the dollar is so strong now, it's offset any movement we've had in the poor countries with regards to food pricing. We were able to avert famine in the last couple of years as I went to the leaders of the world, said if you don't respond, you will have catastrophe on catastrophe, is particularly in the height of COVID. And the leaders did respond. We averted famine. But then Ukraine comes on, shutting down the breadbasket of the world that produces enough food to feed 400 million people.
From there, let's move on to something else real fast. Okay, so I showed a news story about this in the last video I did. But let's talk about it real quick and listen to what this psychopath says. Jacinda Ardern. There will be only one source of truth, and free speech is, and I quote, a weapon of war. She calls for your censorship. Yes, she thinks citizens who think and speak for themselves are a danger to the quote-unquote new normal. She calls for a new type of internet with rules and transparency. And I quote from Jacinda Ardern, "How do you tackle climate change if people don't believe it exists?" This right here is the face of authoritarianism. Even though it does look different than what you were taught to expect, this is the mindset of tyrants everywhere. This right here is someone who is so drunk on power, so inebriated by her own sense of righteousness and superiority, that she views dissent as an evil too dangerous to allow. This is crazy. And you know, it's kind of hard for me to rationalize their mentalities, How do you even get this delusional? Now, one important part to mention is the fact that most of the people at the UN, well, they left. They did not even want to listen to her speak. So I think most people understand that she's, just crazy. However, she is a good little puppet, so I guess that counts for something, I guess. Moving on. Now for this section, and to finish up the video, we're going to read an article from Sociable. You can find a link in the description. However, it's about the clip of the UN rep telling the World Economic Forum that, and I quote, "We own the science." Now we're going to go deep into this because there's a lot more sinister information lurking right beneath the surface. Alright, so let's get started.
We partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world, should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. But again, it's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
During the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact meetings last week, the unelected globalists held a panel on quote-unquote tackling disinformation, where participants from the UN, CNN, and Brown University discussed how to best control narratives. So Melissa Fleming, the Secretary for Global Communications at the UN, well, she highlighted that the United Nations had partnered with several big tech companies, including TikTok and Google, to control medical and climate narratives while claiming, and I quote again, "We own the science." So, on the topic of controlling climate change narratives, Fleming remarked that the United Nations had partnered with Google so that unelected, globalist, authoritative narratives would appear at the top of search results. This is corporatism. Big tech is big government. So basically, she went on to say that the reason why they did this was because when they were in the office, they tried Googling climate change and they got a bunch of results that they did not like. And it's kind of like what Jacinda Ardern said. Now, I am paraphrasing, but she basically said, how can we move towards Agenda 2030 when people don't believe that climate change exists? Well, this is how. They influence search results, they hide information, and through censorship. And I quote again, "We're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world should know it, and the platforms themselves also do." However, their strategy did not end with just, manipulating search results on Google. She also highlighted how the UN worked directly with TikTok on a project called Team Halo, where they would boost, medical predicament messaging coming from both the medical and scientific communities on the Chinese-owned video sharing platform. And I quote, "We had another trusted messenger project, which was called Team Halo, where we trained scientists around the world and some doctors on TikTok, and we had TikTok working with us," end of quote. This is insane. The UN claims to own the science, but if we take a closer look at who funds the UN's directing and coordinating authority on international health, the World Health Organization, well, once you find out who funds them, we get a much clearer picture of who is really calling the shots. Historically speaking, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, along with the Gates-backed Gavi Alliance, have contributed more to the WHO program than all member nations in the world except for two, the United States and the UK. So let me ask you again, who owns the science? Well, a smart individual might say, follow the money. Anyway, during last week's World Economic Forum panel, the UN Global Communications rep went on to admit that people did not trust institutions like the UN, especially when it came to information related to the medical predicament. And so to counter this, the United Nations looked to influencers to get its messaging through the back door. And I quote, "Another really key strategy we had was to deploy influencers." Alright. So the idea of infiltrating and subverting online groups from within by targeting influencers, well, as it turns out, it mirrors recommendations coming out of a Google-backed RAND report published in 2021. In this report, they actually detail how to control conspiracists by leveraging people they trust against them. So, I'm just warning you, be on the lookout for shills. They actually went into great detail about how they could leverage influencers or quote-unquote brand ambassadors to push out their agenda messaging. Again, check out the link if you're interested in reading more about that aspect. Now you may ask, who was moderating this World Economic Forum event? Well, it was moderated by a World Economic Forum director, Adrian Monk, who in recent months have been name-calling critics of the Great Reset, and anyone who opposes the Great Reset is just a white supremacist or an anti-Semite engaged in far-right disinformation campaigns. These people are insane. Okay, so now we gotta talk about CNN's role in this little event about tackling disinformation. And for this, we have to talk about CNN's Rachel Smolkin. She said that CNN was actually part of a political war strategy to, and I quote, own the narrative. And I quote again, CNN is both an organization that's trying to make sense of the world and trying to establish the facts. It's also part of a political war on who owns the narrative. Ay, man, these people are out of their minds. Now, according to the Mint Press News, CNN received $3.6 million in donations from none other than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the same organization that's been heavily invested in the World Health Organization. You're starting to see how this all works. The investigation revealed that Gates has also donated a whopping $319 million to many of the biggest and most influential corporate news outlets in the world. Again, I'll ask you, who is really the ones engaged in political war on who owns the narrative? Speaking of owning narratives, last year the World Economic Forum launched the Great Narrative Initiative, and it is a sequel to the Great Reset, or really runs parallel to it, with the goal of reshaping all aspects of society and the global economy. We have talked about this event before. The idea of the Great Narrative is something that French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, well, he called it a quote-unquote grand narrative or a meta-narrative, which, according to him, functions to legitimize power, authority, and social customs, which coincidentally is exactly what the Great Reset is trying to achieve. So once the Great Reset has its great narrative implemented, any opposing narrative can be dismissed as disinformation, conspiracy, or extremism, and it must be censored or suppressed for the greater collective good. Yes, in one single World Economic Forum panel on quote-unquote tackling disinformation, we saw these unelected bureaucrats claim that they basically had a monopoly on science itself, and that corporate media was embroiled in a battle to own the narrative. How crazy is that? However, in regards to the medical predicament and the setup of their great narrative, which by the way, we are all dismantling day by day. Anyway, it was the new King Charles III, who was prince at the time of the Great Reset launch. Anyway, he said, and I quote, "We have a golden opportunity to see something good from this crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change." In a very similar message, World Economic Forum Klaus Schwab said that the pandemic represented, and I quote, "a rare but narrow window of opportunity to initiate the Great Reset agenda." And really, all I have to say is this. If anyone was quote-unquote seizing the opportunity to exploit people's fears during the pandemic, it would be unelected bureaucrats, the US establishment, the entire global establishment really, the media, the various health organizations, Fauci and the CDC, the NIH, the British Crown too. All of them would certainly be at the top of that list. The list of exploitative and amoral tactics is long, and those tactics have been repeatedly used against us all. By declaring that they, quote-unquote, own the science, partnering with big tech companies to manipulate search results to influence public opinion, by them pouring millions and millions of dollars into media outlets, the unelected bureaucrats are once again showing us their true colors. Owning the science leads to owning the narrative. Owning the narrative means controlling thought and speech. Controlling thought and speech means the end of free society. And with that, I welcome you to the Great Reset. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals or Subscribestar. As always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and of course, I do hope you have a good night.